of the C&O Canal started in the Georgetown district of Washington, D.C. in 1828 and progressed westward and a little bit north, following generally the path of the Potomac River. And in 1835, the canal opened from 2 miles downstream from here at Dam 5 and went downstream at that point, including the port of Williamsport, all the way to Washington, D.C. And so the canal was operating after 1835 in that distance. About that time, 1835, construction started, engineering and construction started in this area right here. And in 1839, this section opened up from Dam 6, past the port of Hancock, and down to Dam 5 and on to Washington, D.C. And finally, in 1850, the canal opened to its western terminus in Cumberland, Maryland. And it operated over that full length for just short of 75 years. So when the canal was being built, or engineered, I guess, in this area, if y'all get a little bit closer, I'm going to show you a map, if you could get close enough to see this, and I'll pass it around when I'm finished. The canal company decided, instead of following the river around Prather's Neck, which is 3.5 miles, they were going to build the canal directly across the neck, a distance of 1/2 mile. In making that decision, they cut out 3 miles of canal construction, which was a $1 savings at that time. But more importantly, for the long haul, they cut out 3 miles of travel on the canal. So it took less time overall to get to Washington, D.C., or from Washington to Cumberland. So the river going upstream goes around like this. And we're standing right here. All right, so the river goes upstream around this neck like this, and the canal towpath comes out where my finger is now. And cutting out that territory made a whole lot of sense, but as the river winds its way around Prather's Neck, it gathers 36 feet in elevation. Okay, going upstream now. It gathers 36 feet in elevation. So the river's 36 feet higher here than over here. So the canal company, in constructing through this area, had to account for that much lift, and you can't do that with 1 lock or even 2 locks. So we ended up with 4 locks here in a fairly short distance. As we're going to walk between all 4 today, and you're going to see how close they are together. They're really close. And so they made that decision, and in this area, let me pass this around. In this area, the land for the canal was condemned from a gentleman named Samuel Prather, who was a farmer. He had a large farm here, and more about Samuel Prather later. But the construction, as I said before, finished in 1839. So we're going to walk up to the level of the towpath right now, and I just want to mention before we go up there that there is some traffic on the canal this morning. We've had several through bikers go through and some hikers and so on. So I'd like you all to be aware of the fact we need to leave some of the towpath empty. We're walking from place to place. If we could just cover half the towpath instead of the whole thing. And when we stop, we're going to stop at Lock 49 first. I'd like you all to see if we can get the whole way off the towpath, so there's a path clear there. And we're going to walk up this road here, go around the gate, and we'll meet over here at Lock 49. some point in time, one of our presidents designated this a national monument, but the real news is that in 1971, the United States Congress established the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park. And today that park preserves this historic transportation system. Now, here we are. This is Lock 49, and I have a question for you. When you look around here, what do we see? And I'm not speaking of trees and wildflowers and white-tailed deer and wild turkeys. What do we see that's man-made that provides evidence of canal operation or people living here? Yes, sir.
Lock.
Locks, and 4 of them. We can see above, upstream from us here, lock 50, 49. We can see 48. And you'll have to trust me, there's another one down there. You can't see it from here. What beside locks? Lock house. Okay. What else we got?
Well, there's a barn up there.
There's a barn up there. Yeah.
And a block cabin there.
A little cabin on the lock. And anybody see anything else?
The remains of several houses or distribution centers that were used during the operation of the canal, I believe, to distribute or sell corn, other things to the people who were operating the boats.
Okay, we've got some evidence of foundation material here and also up at Lock 50 of commercial buildings. We walked by another big piece of evidence, the so-called Flory House, which I could still see the roof of over here. And something that we can't see right now, but I think everybody but John drove through a big stone culvert this morning. That was built during the canal construction here.
Well, what purpose did it serve then?
Well, I'm going to reserve that for a little bit later. The question is, what purpose did it serve then? And I wanted to ask that question, but I'm going to ask it later. All right? Driving in today into Four Locks, along the road into Four Locks, you pass this brick building on your right. That is the old Four Locks School. It's a one-room schoolhouse that was built in 1877 by Washington County. And you also pass this beautiful stone building. I call it a mansion. We're going to call it the Hassett House today. And we're going to be at, when we get down to Lock 48, we're going to be in a position to see a good bit of that house. And we'll talk about who lived there and who lives there now. We give that to, oh, okay.
Now, is it part of the park now?
It is.
It is, okay. I've always wondered, you know, is it or isn't it? You know? Does someone live there?
All right, so with this rather isolated place and not a whole lot of evidence left here, okay? There is evidence, and we just went over it, but there's not a whole lot of evidence here. Would you believe that 75 people lived in this community in 1912? Would you believe that there was a store or a store and a warehouse at each of Block 48, 49, and 50?
Huh.
But there was one at each?
One at each.
Oh, wow.
They're not even a mile apart. And a warehouse at one block.
Actually, store, warehouse, ice house, and more of a warehouse, but also a retail establishment up here.
Huh.
Did they specialize?
Did they specialize? A little bit, but there was a lot that was in common as well. For instance, I think they all sold hay.
Hungry mules coming up there.
Yeah. So this is a photostatic copy of a copy of a pamphlet or little booklet published by the park. It was written by a gentleman named Mike Mastrangelo, who was actually a law enforcement ranger, but he lived in this community and got interested in the history. And the reason I want to pass this around is this lock we're at right now. This is a photograph of the store. It's that over the bypass flume here, and a boat coming out of the lock going that way. So the photographer was standing on the towpath a ways down here, almost to the next lock. All right, and I'll pass that around. That kind of tells you what a freight boat looks like. They were about 90 feet long, 14.5 feet wide. And this photograph is even more telling. It is also at this lock. And it is also at the store that sat over the bypass flume here. And the lady that's standing on this boat, I think she's standing on the hatch covers of the boat, is very close to the store. There are two men in the background. One of them's standing on the rocks or walking on the rock over here. The other one's a little bit to the right of that, but he's at the porch of this store. Okay? Now, if you dropped your hat in the canal, if you were a canal boat crew and you lost your hat in the canal and you were locking through 49 here, this woman's position shows you how close you would be to the store while your boat was locking through. You could literally step off the boat, go in the store, buy a hat, and be out in the 10 or 15 minutes it takes to lock through. I doubt if that happened, because you probably had some stories to share, but it would be possible. It would certainly be possible to run in there and get a plug of tobacco and be back. Okay? All right, so I'm going to pass that around. And I should identify, when I say the store's over the bypass flume, what am I talking about? The big ditch right behind me is the lock. That's where the boats transferred through. And if they were going upstream, they got lifted to the next level, okay? Coming downstream, they got dropped to the next level. Well, with the idea of the canal next to a river, the water for navigation came from the river. So they built a series of dams, built up a head of water, and diverted some of that water into the canal. So the water for this part of the canal came from Dam 6, upstream from Hancock. And by virtue of that water coming in and somewhat going downhill, you had flat water between locks, but there was a little current, not a big current, but a little current going downstream all the time. So if you closed the lock gates on the upper part of the lock here and did not have a bypass flume, eventually the water would build up and go over the lock, go over the gates into the lock. Not a good thing, especially if you're trying to lower a boat. So every lock had another ditch, a bypass flume. So the stores very often sat over the bypass flume. And we can see foundation material over here, not for the front of the store, but for the back of the store. All right, so kind of neat. All right, I would like to walk up to four locks within a half a mile, one lock house. How do you think it would be for one family, mostly husband and wife, to operate 4 locks in the community? You're shaking your head. Insane.
Would you ever sleep?
Insane. But nonetheless, from what I can tell, that's what the company had in mind. And when you think about, at times in the history of this canal, 500 boats going up and down here in the boating season, this would be quite a traffic jam if only one family was operating 4 locks. But the canal company only paid one family at Lock 49 there in the official company lock house. But we know from 2 different historical sources that there were actually more lock tenders here. First of all, census records from 1900 and 1910. There are other people besides the folks in the lock house who listed their occupation as lock tender. And number 2, we have a couple pieces of correspondence. I'm going to read from one that was written in 1911 from a person who lived in this area, Samuel Fernsner, to somebody that was familiar with the community and knew the people here. And I'm going to quote, "Flynn's still have the lower 2 locks of the 4. Samuel Taylor has lock 49, and Henry Meyer's widow has the upper lock." Okay, starting down below, we had the Flynn family, and we're going to be walking by where their house used to be. A little bit later, I'm going to point it out. They had a dad and 3 sons. And at times, each of those people were involved in tending locks 47 and 48. Samuel Taylor was the official lock tender, the employee of the canal, if you will. And he came here in 1889. I don't know whether it was before or after the big flood of that year. Came here and assumed his duties in 1889 and stayed until the canal closed in 1924.
We have a biker approaching soon.
Okay. Thank you, John. And Henry Myers, his house was right in this area. There is some foundation material back here, but if you walk just to the end of the lockup there, the root cellar is still off on the side, on the river side of the towpath up there. Sometime before 1911, Henry Myers, who had been tending this lock, passed away, according to that letter, because it says that Henry Myers' widow was tending this lock. Her name was Ellen, and it is not unusual in the history of the canal to have a male lock tender pass away and the female takes over. The spouse takes over. A little bit more typical to have the next generation. You know, like there are some locks down close to DC, they're actually named for families that were in the lock house generation after generation. So that's kind of cool. Here at Lock 50, one of the Hassett family applied for permission to build a warehouse and store over the bypass flume. I think it was 1865, and he received permission and was charged $36 a year in rent from the canal company. The canal company owned the land, okay? So if you built your house or commercial property on their land, you had to pay land rent. So the store here was run by the Hassett brothers until somewhere between 1900 and 1915. And at that point, they went out of business, and the canal company took over the warehouse here. And they kind of stored stuff for the maintenance division in this building, and also stored some other things for boat operations. And that brings me to the question I had before. If you were the Hassett brothers and you were here, say, in 1870, and you wanted to stock your store with things to serve canal boat captains in the operation of their boat, what would you have for sale? Yes.
Hay and oil.
Hay and oil, okay? I'm going to add grain. Hay and grain was the fuel for this transportation system. And what would the oil be for? I got an answer to that, but do you have an answer?
To oil the rudder to keep it moving.
There you go. Good answer. And I was thinking of a different kind of oil to keep your leather in good shape. And what else would you have for sale? Yes.
Tow ropes.
Tow ropes, and also balanced stern lines. When your boat came into a lock, it was moving, right? And you didn't want to hit the other gate. If you're going upstream, you didn't want to hit that gate up there. If you're going downstream, you didn't want to hit this gate.
Excuse me, old man, I'm a biker.
Okay, thank you. Biker up. So, the deckhand would step off the boat with a bow or stern line in hand and whip that thing around a snubbing post, and there would be typically 3 right through here, and stop the boat. So you had to have tow line, and you also had to have boat lines, if you will, bow and stern, perhaps midships, depending on the captain. What else would you have for sale?
Liquor.
I know, someone had to say it.
This would have been a good place to have liquor, because apparently one of the best whiskey production areas in the whole canal was on Prather's Neck. They had some pretty good booze here, apparently. There's sort of mixed stories on liquor on the boat with the boat crew. It was definitely discouraged by the canal company, and there are interviews of people that worked on boats that survived long enough to be interviewed for books that are now available. And there are some stories in there about captains and boat crews who were running drunk, but for the most part, I would say maybe not so much.
Wasn't the Williamsport a popular stop that people wanted to get to because it had a reputation as a place where you could sort of, for lack of a better word, unwind?
I didn't know that, John, but you know, you lived in Williamsport for a while. I'm retired from Cumberland, and there's a real rep up there.
I think it's the same thing was true in Williamsport too.
Okay.
When people tried to, if you were, especially if you were single, it was a nice place to overnight.
Yeah. Well put.
So, are you going to bring up that in the early days, the barges were owned by the captain, generally, the captain? They were privately owned rather than being owned by the company.
Right. That is true. And, you know, back when the canal opened in this area, your typical boat was going to be owned often by the captain. There was a man here in town that owned several boats, and he couldn't captain them all. And I would assume that many of the boats were privately owned, but crewed by employees, basically.
And a fellow like this one would work on it.
Yeah, he'd be the mule driver.
What was the protocol, Lowell, of the boats going east and west? Who got first dibs on who went through the locks?
I have an answer to that, but let me finish with Nathan's thought, if you don't mind. The canal started to have some real financial difficulties after the flood of 1889. And so it was harder to operate for everybody, the canal company especially. And the investors in the canal turned out over a period of time to match the investors of the B&O Railroad. Okay? And to some extent, those people wanted to keep the canal in operation to avoid this real estate being acquired by a competing railroad. Okay? So they kept the canal running perhaps beyond its prime. And one of the things they did in 1902 was bought all the boats they could and started a subsidiary called the Canal Towage Company, which owned the great majority of boats operating on the canal after that. it took away the captain's independence, and that's why when I talked about the Hassets not operating their store here, the company kind of took over. One of the things they had was hay for the company horses, or mules, excuse me, hay and grain for the company mules. And if you had a boat that had company mules, this is a place you would stop for fuel. So yeah, that did occur, and then until the end, most of the boats were owned by the Canal Towage Company. Now, one of the other things, anybody else have something that they'd like to have for sale here? Tobacco. Yeah.
Like flour and potatoes and food that would.
Yeah.
Pantry stable.
I think all these stores had that.
Yeah.
All the food necessary, but particularly for boat operations, the other thing that I thought of was tack for the mules. That stuff wears out and needs repair, and you might have to replace like a bridle or a harness or what have you, and this would be the place to buy it right here. Now operations here, most of our boat captains would stop for the night, and everybody would sleep. And it was very typical, not uniform, but typical for a boat to stop about 10 p.m. and for the crew to rise a little bit after 4 and start moving about 5 in the morning. But there was always some captains who believed the only way to make the real money was to run 24/7. And those people would typically have more mules. They might have 6, so they'd have 2 working, 4 resting, and they would have to have extra crew to operate 24 hours a day. That meant for Henry Myers here at Lock 50, and later for Ellen, that they might be called out at night. And one way to deal with that, especially when Henry was still alive and Ellen could get some rest in the house at night, was for the lock tender to be in that house and take a nap and wait for the next boat to come through. Downstairs if there was a 2-story house or whatever, and make their way outside. There were a lot of watch shanties up and down the canal. They were not at all uncommon. There are a lot of historic photographs of watch shanties, not on every lock, but on many, many locks. That one is the only one left in 184.5 miles of canal. It's kind of a little treasure, and I hope the Park Service is able to fix it up when it needs to be fixed, and that could be soon. So. company on its route encountered a river or a very large stream, they built an aqueduct. An aqueduct is basically like a bridge that went over that river or stream and carried the water of the canal and a place for the mules to walk. Whenever they encountered a small stream, they built a culvert, which is like a tunnel, and it went under the canal and under the towpath and allowed a stream inland to flow through the culvert and then continue on its way to the Potomac River. But the culvert we drove through this morning is way bigger than the stream that goes through there. I believe the surface of the road in there was pretty dry today. But there is a trickle that comes down here and goes through that culvert. When it rains, we get 2 or 3 inches of water standing in the bottom of that culvert. But that culvert's way bigger than necessary to handle that stream. Why is the culvert so big?
There were houses on both sides and you wanted wagons to go.
There were houses on both sides. Now, the typical solution that the canal company used was a bridge over the canal. But there are 2 road culverts that I know about, and perhaps others. This is one, and there's also one at McCoy's Ferry. So there were farms out on Prather's Neck. I mentioned some of those farmers made pretty good whiskey. But they had to get their product to market. They had to go to the county courthouse once in a while, go to the bank and stuff like that. So the canal company had to account for traffic across the canal because those farmers didn't want to swim their barrels of whiskey across the canal. And that's why the culvert's so big. Now, let's turn our attention to this beautiful stone building up here, which I'm calling the Hassett House. That was originally built by Samuel Prather. Samuel Prather was the farmer that owned the farmland around here that was condemned for the canal. But there's a keystone on the front of the house that says 1868. And Samuel Prather was dead by that point in time, and his son, Jonathan, and his wife, Anne, occupied the house at that time. Okay, bikers up, folks. So Jonathan purchased the store at 49. It was started by Denton Jakes in 1863, but purchased by Jonathan in 1878. He and his wife purchased the store. Tragically, Jonathan died that same year. But his widow, Anne, continued to run the store at Lock 49 until 1905 when she passed away. And in that year, 1905, Margaret and Thomas Hassett purchased the beautiful building up there. Now, Thomas was a purchaser for the canal. By that I mean if the canal company needed a dozen shovels, Mr. Thomas Hassett would shop around for price and quality and make arrangements for purchase and make arrangements for those products to be delivered wherever they were needed on the canal. But Thomas Hassett was also a bank vice president over in Clear Spring. He was a member of the board of directors of the Potomac Edison Power Company. He was twice elected to the Board of Commissioners of Washington County. And for those of you that are not Marylanders, the county commission is the leading government body in the Maryland counties. So if there were bigwigs living in Forlocks in the early 1900s, it was Margaret and Thomas Hassett. And they lived there until 1941. At some point in time, the National Park Service acquired the property, and today it is used to house volunteers, interns, and brand new employees. A brand new